Stand on the Ponte Vecchio today, and you see jewelers behind glass windows, tourists leaning over stone parapets, the Arno glinting below in the afternoon light. Florence looks like a city that always knew what it was: elegant, composed, certain of its own importance. But go back 800 years, to roughly the year 1200, and you would not recognize this place at all. The bridge you're standing on doesn't exist yet. The cathedral dome you see in every photograph has not been imagined. The Palazzo della Signoria, the great fortress palace that now anchors the city's political heart, is still a generation away from being built. What you find instead is something rawer, louder, more violent, and in many ways more fascinating. Welcome to Florence in 1200, a city that is already wealthy, already ambitious, already dangerous, and already laying the foundations of a civilization that will, 2 centuries later, change the course of human history. The year is approximately 1200. Florence, known in Latin as Florentia, founded as a Roman military colony in 59 BC, has survived centuries of occupation by Ostrogoths, Byzantines, Lombards, and Franks. It has been ruled by bishops, by the Carolingian Empire, and most recently by the powerful Countess Matilda of Tuscany, who died in 1115 and left behind a city politically energized and economically primed to govern itself. By 1200, Florence is a commune, governed not by a king or a duke, but by elected consuls drawn from its leading families. This was not democracy as we understand it. The consuls were almost entirely drawn from the nobility, men whose status came from land, lineage, and the ability to field armed men in the street. But it was something new in post-Roman Europe, a city trying to run itself. The population at this moment sits at around 30,000 people. That number sounds modest by today's standards, but it will roughly triple within the next century, making Florence one of the largest cities in Western Europe. Something enormous is happening here, and the people living through it in 1200 can feel it. In the construction noise, in the crowded marketplaces, in the constant arrival of families migrating in from the Tuscan countryside. Florence in 1200 is not a finished city. It is a city in the process of becoming something, and no one yet knows what. If you walked the streets of Florence in 1200, the most immediate shock would not be the dirt or the noise, though both would be considerable. It would be the towers. Rising above the dense grid of narrow streets that still followed the old Roman layout, the same rectangular blocks laid down when this was a garrison town, were dozens of tall, narrow stone towers built by Florence's most powerful families. Estimates from the period and from later chronicles suggest there may have been well over 100 of these towers at their peak, clustered thickly enough to give the city a jagged skyline unlike anything in the modern world. Some rose 50, 60, even 70 meters above the rooftops. They were not churches. They were private fortifications. Each tower belonged to a clan. The Uberti had towers. The Amidei had towers. The Donati, the Adimari, the Lamberti, all had towers. These structures served a dual purpose. They were symbols of power and prestige in a city where status was contested daily. But they were also genuine fortifications, designed for exactly the kind of urban combat that Florence experienced repeatedly. In a dispute, and disputes in this city were constant. A family could retreat into its tower, haul up the ladder, and fire down on enemies below, while servants set fire to rival properties at street level. The tower was simultaneously a statement of wealth and a survival mechanism. The streets between these towers were narrow enough that in some alleys, neighbors on upper floors could shake hands across the gap. They were largely unpaved, muddy in winter, dusty in summer. Household waste, food scraps, human waste, or animal dung was thrown into the street or ran in open channels along the gutters. There was no municipal sanitation system worthy of the name. The Arno River, which ran through the city's southern edge, served as a convenient disposal point for everything the city produced, from dye house runoff to slaughterhouse waste. The smell in summer would have been extraordinary. And yet, to the people living there, this was home. They knew these streets by name, by smell, by the sounds that came from particular workshops. The city was alive in ways that are difficult to separate from the disorder. What did ordinary Florentines actually do each day in 1200? The city's economy was already organizing itself around wool. Merchants imported raw fleece, much of it still sourced from Italy and southern France at this point, as English wool imports would expand significantly later in the century, and set workshops to carding, spinning, weaving, and dyeing it. The Arno's water was essential. Dyers used it in enormous quantities, and the river ran with color from the dyeing districts. This industry drew workers from the countryside in steady waves, filling the city's poorer districts with laborers who slept in crowded tenement-style buildings and worked long hours for wages controlled by the merchant class above them. Digital repository, Trinkle +1. Above the laborers were the artisans, cobblers, blacksmiths, carpenters, bakers, butchers, organized increasingly into guilds, the arti, which by this period were already beginning to regulate trade, set standards, and accumulate political weight. The guild system in Florence is not yet the formalized structure it will become by the late 13th century, but the framework is present. Merchants and craftsmen are beginning to understand that collective organization gives them power they cannot have alone. Above the artisans were the merchant families, not yet the banking dynasties of the later medieval period, but men who moved wool, spices, and money across trade routes that connected Tuscany to northern Europe and the Mediterranean world simultaneously. Florence sat on the road between Rome and the north, and between the wool-producing hinterland and the ports of Pisa and Genoa. Geography was making these merchants rich almost despite themselves. Food for most of the population was simple. Bread, legumes, vegetables, and wine formed the core of everyday diet. Meat was available but expensive. The market in the central square, located at the old Roman Forum, roughly where Piazza della Repubblica stands today, was the commercial heart of the city, loud and crowded every morning. Butchers, bakers, grain sellers, and cloth merchants competed for space in a square that had once, over 1,000 years before, been the center of Roman civic life. Religion was the architecture of daily existence. The baptistry of San Giovanni, the octagonal structure that stands to this day in front of the cathedral, was already ancient by 1200, and it was the symbolic heart of Florentine religious identity. Every Florentine was baptized there. It was, in the deepest sense, where the city's sense of self was ritually confirmed. The current cathedral building, Santa Maria del Fiore, the one with Brunelleschi's famous dome, does not yet exist. In 1200, the cathedral site is occupied by an earlier church called Santa Reparata, a much more modest structure. The massive rebuilding that will transform the city's skyline is still a century away. Florence in 1200 is a city of rising tensions. And in 1216, those tensions crystallize into something that will define the city's politics for generations. The story begins with a broken marriage contract. A nobleman named Buondelmonte dei Buondelmonti had promised to marry a young woman from the Amadei family. He backed out of the arrangement at the last moment, choosing to marry a woman from the rival Donati clan instead. On Easter morning of that year, members of the Amadei family ambushed Buondelmonte as he crossed a bridge over the Arno and killed him. The murder was not unusual in itself. Violence between noble families was common enough. What made this incident transformative was what happened next. The nobility of Florence divided into two factions along lines that had been forming for decades. The Guelphs, who broadly supported the authority of the Pope, and the Ghibellines, who supported the Holy Roman Emperor. These were not simply religious positions. They were political identities layered over existing family rivalries, trade disputes, and struggles for control of the commune's institutions. Once attached to the violence of 1216, these identities hardened into something close to ideology. For the next century and beyond, Guelph and Ghibelline would define which families you trusted, which streets were safe to walk, and which towers you needed to fear. The factional conflict reshaped Florence physically. When one faction gained control of the commune, it destroyed the towers of its enemies. The Ghibellines, during periods of their dominance, demolished over 85 Guelph towers. When the Guelphs returned to power, they took their revenge. What had been a skyline of over 100 towers was gradually reduced, until finally the commune itself passed regulations capping private tower height at 29 meters, a direct response to the chaos that these structures had enabled. The tower-cutting ordinance is one of the more remarkable moments in medieval urban history. A city legislating against its own architecture because that architecture had become a weapon. Madoff Tuscany +1. But the same period that generated this violence also generated extraordinary economic growth. Between 1200 and 1300, Florence's population did not just grow, it exploded, roughly tripling or even quadrupling to reach an estimated 120,000 people by the early 14th century. This made it one of the largest cities in Europe. In 1172, the commune had built new walls to accommodate its growing suburbs. By 1282, even those walls were insufficient, and a new circuit was planned, 8,500 meters long, enclosing an area 5 times larger than the previous walls had contained. The city was consuming its own edges as fast as it could build them, world history +1. The mendicant orders, the Franciscans and Dominicans, arrived in Florence in the early 13th century, and their impact on the city was profound. They built large churches in the outer neighborhoods, organized hospitals and schools, and embedded themselves in the social fabric of a rapidly urbanizing population. At the great churches of Santa Croce and Santa Maria Novella, which still define the city's eastern and western edges today, grew from Franciscan and Dominican foundations established in this period. Walk through Florence today with this history in mind, and the city begins to reveal its past in unexpected places. The street grid of the historic center still follows, in broad outline, the Roman layout of Florentia. The rectangular blocks, the north-south and east-west axes, these were cut 2,000 years ago, and the medieval city never erased them. It built on top of them. The baptistry is still there, unchanged in its essential form from what a Florentine in 1200 would have recognized. The Arno still runs where it always ran. Some of the tower stumps, truncated by communal decree, converted into residences, survive embedded in the walls of later buildings, visible if you know what to look for. What has gone is the texture, the towers, the noise, the open sewers, the faction flags hanging from windows, the armed men in livery moving through narrow streets. The violence and the energy that characterized Florence in 1200 have been absorbed into stone and marble and dissolved into the image of an elegant Renaissance city. But the Renaissance did not appear from nothing. It grew from precisely this soil: merchant wealth, political competition, civic ambition, and a culture that treated prestige as something worth fighting for with money, architecture, and, if necessary, blood. By 1300, Florence is almost unrecognizable from what it was in 1200. The population has exploded. New walls are going up. The old cathedral is being torn down and replaced with something that will eventually bear the most recognizable dome in the world. The guild system has matured into a powerful political force. The Guelph faction have decisively expelled the Ghibellines. Banking families are becoming international powers, lending money to kings. The city of 1200, with its towers and its feuds and its muddy streets and its 30,000 inhabitants crowded between Roman-era walls, is the foundation beneath all of it. The Renaissance is often described as a rebirth, but something has to die for there to be a rebirth. What died, slowly, over the 13th century was the tower house world of feuding noble clans. What replaced it was something more complex, more commercially driven, more culturally ambitious. Florence in 1200 is the city before the transformation. It is the city in the middle of becoming. And understanding it, understanding the violence, the ambition, the economic energy, the sheer human intensity of that place, is essential to understanding why, 2 centuries later, this city produced art and thought that the entire world still carries with it. The towers are mostly gone. The feuds are long resolved, but the ambition never left.